Welcome to Thinking About Religion. I'm Dale Tuggy. As far as traditional Christians are concerned, you can hold the scriptures in one hand. Things are a bit different in Islam, as my guest today explains. His name is Dr. Jonathan Brown, and he's the Al-Walid bin Talal Chair of Islamic Civilization in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Dr. Brown's studies have taken him to such countries as Egypt, Syria, Turkey, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, South Africa, Indonesia, India, and Iran. We'll be talking about some themes from his book, Misquoting Muhammad, The Challenges and Choices of Interpreting the Prophet's Legacy. Dr. Brown, welcome to Thinking About Religion.
Well, thanks for having me.
In American evangelical Christianity, sometimes they talk about the Bible as a kind of handbook for life. And it's widely held that ordinary Christians can simply read and understand the Bible, at least after it's been translated into English, and then apply the Bible to their lives. In traditional Islamic societies, is this how the Qur'an was viewed?
Oh, that's such a hard question to answer. There's a kind of a paradox. A lot of Muslims, and I mean millions of Muslims. I mean, if you went into a mosque, there might be one or two Muslims just in that room. A lot of Muslims memorize the entire Qur'an, I mean, word for word. In fact, there's a great documentary called Qur'an by Heart, where you see this kind of international Qur'an competition. There's a kid from Uzbekistan, there's a girl from Bangladesh, there's a kid from a boy from Senegal. So, I mean, Muslims around the world memorize the entire Qur'an, word for word. And, when Muslims pray, they recite parts of the Qur'an, word for word, from memory. So in one sense, I'd say Muslim engagement with the Qur'an is almost just structurally more immediate than almost any other religion that at least I know of. Both in the sense of the memorization of the entire book for a lot of Muslims, memorization of parts of the book for a lot of other Muslims, and then just everyday constant recitation.
But of course, a lot of these people are not Arabic speakers. Yeah.
So then this is a kind of paradox, right? Which is that though the Qur'an has immense meaning for them, and if you go to these, Qur'an schools in Mali or Senegal or Niger or something, you see these kids just sitting there writing out the Qur'an on these wooden boards with charcoal ink and memorizing it, and then they wash the boards off with water, and then they drink the water with the ink of the Qur'an as part of the end of their lesson. This has immense meaning for them. There's a wonderful book it's been translated in English from French, called The Ambiguous Adventure by a Senegalese author named Amadou Khan. And he talks about this experience of him learning the Qur'an as a child and how this words were the structure of the universe. They were the very structure of the universe. But at the same time, they don't understand the words. Or if they do understand them, they are sort of, told what they mean. So if you learn the meaning of the Qur'an by rote, it's not like you become a master of the Arabic language and then you approach the Qur'an de novo and you sort of have your own experience with it. You're instructed to what these words mean. You learn the meaning of the Qur'an and as the beginning of Arabic. So in that sense, there's an irony because, most of the Muslims in the world are not native Arabic speakers. There's only, I can't remember, 200, 300 million Arabs in the world or something. And the rest of the 1.5, 1.6 billion Muslims in the world are not native Arabic speakers, and a lot of them don't know Arabic at all in terms of the meaning. They might be able to read the words, they might even have memorized large chunks of the Qur'an, but they only know the meaning in a very kind of distant way, not in a kind of immediate language experience. So, not the way, for example, even a good English speaker today, if they hear, a Shakespearean play, or if they, watch Henry V and see his St. Crispin's Day speech, that really hits you. Some of the words might be a little weird, but it really, you still have this immediate language experience with that. I think for, Muslims who aren't Arabic speakers, unless they're very educated, they're really, really highly educated, Arabophone, in fact, they don't have that language connection. It's more of a connection to the words as the words of God, regardless of what their actual meaning is, almost to the structure of the words. The paradox is that compared to, let's say, a lot of evangelical Christians in America, they have a much more immediate connection to the Qur'an. They recite it, they memorize it in its original language. They often memorize massive chunks of it, and perhaps the whole thing in its original language. And yet they don't have that kind of semantic engagement with it that maybe someone who sits and reads the Bible today in Bible study would have. Now, Of course, for Arabic speakers, there's a lot more likelihood that they have that connection. And I don't want to say that non-Arab or non-Arabic speaking Muslims don't have the connection at all, but it's something that I think you find much more at like elite educated levels, or that experience is just, it's more mediated by instruction, that they are told by their madrasa teachers, or told by their teachers in school what these words mean. And they might not have as much of a personal relationship of investigation of the scripture as other people would.
So in comparing the Quran to the Bible, I mean, in a sense, they're both supposed to be absolute authorities. But in the case of the Quran, typically you'll more be told what it means than sort of be able to dig through the meaning on your own.
Yes. And again, this is kind of a big generalization. I'm generalizing across 1.5 billion people, from West Africa to Southeast Asia. Yes, in the sense that it's not their native language. They would have translations, or they'd have commentaries in their native language. But when you're reading a translation or a commentary, you're really, in a sense, being told what it means by the translator or by the commentator. There's a lot of mediation by clerical class, whether it's in school or whether it's through a teacher in the mosque or something like that.
So, Dr. Brown, everyone nowadays has heard of the Quran. Some of us have read it all the way through. But much of your interesting book, Misquoting Muhammad, is about another class of Islamic scriptures, one which is arguably more foundational to Islamic law. Tell us about these.
Yeah, so this is what's called Hadith. Hadith are reports about the things that the Prophet Muhammad said or did, or basically his actions and his words. It's reports about his precedent and his lifestyle and his rulings. The Qur'an is a relatively small book, and it doesn't have a lot of legal material in it, or even doctrinal material in it. A lot of it is sort of ethical exhortations, reminders to fear God, to believe in God. So, I mean, even things like, like the 5 daily prayers, the Qur'an never says pray 5 times a day. And the Qur'an tells you to pray. It doesn't tell you when to pray. It doesn't tell you how to pray. It doesn't tell you, what to do if you make mistakes in your prayer. So these things all come from the teachings of the Prophet. Muslim scholars have always understood these to be basically explanations of the Qur'an. So that the Prophet's precedent, which in Arabic is called his sunnah, it's S-U-N-N-A, his sunnah. The Prophet's authoritative precedent is a infallible application of the Book of God. So it's basically the Prophet living out and applying through his words and deeds and actions the message of the Qur'an. So the Hadiths are one of the major ways to know about the precedent of the Prophet. Other ways include communal practice, traditions that are passed on from generation to generation. Another way would be just methods of reasoning, of legal reasoning, of thinking about what the principles of the Quran are, how they're applied. But one of the main ways is through these reports that are called hadiths.
So if I go to a bookstore, why isn't there next to the Quran just another paperback that costs $20 and it's the hadiths?
Because the hadith corpus is massive. It's massive.
How massive are we talking?
I don't think it's actually encompassable. I'll tell you why. So the Quran is written down and promulgated officially within 20 years of the death of the Prophet. So around 650. And even, with the exception of some really kind of stubborn revisionist Western scholars, I mean, even the state of the state of the field in Western scholarship on Islam is that the Quran comes from the mid 7th century. It comes from Arabia in the mid 7th century, and there's not really a lot of debate about that. But the hadiths are not written down during the time of the Prophet. They're not written down in any systematic way for around 100, 120 years after the death of the Prophet. During that 120, 150 years, the Muslim community goes through 3 civil wars and expands from basically being in Central and Western Arabia to controlling the entire Middle East and North Africa, Iran, Central Asia, into India. So Muslims have gone from being a small group of Arabs to being this kind of ruling class over an incredibly culturally heterogeneous and diverse area, with everybody trying to kind of shoehorn their political, cultural, religious, legal agendas into Islam. And what better way to do that than to say, oh, the Prophet said my guy should be the caliph. No, the Prophet said my guy should be the caliph. No, the Prophet said Persians are the best. No, the Prophet said Aramaic speakers are the best, whatever. So people just started forging thousands and thousands and thousands of hadiths in the generation after the first generation of Muslims. This is just like an engine of this that goes on chugging at full speed for a good 3 or 4 centuries.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the problems that Muslim scholars have immediately, both Sunni and Shiite scholars, is how do they sort what are authentic words of the Prophet from forgeries?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of disagreement about what is authentic, what is not authentic, according to your different school of thought, according to your sectarian identity. You actually don't really have a discrete body of what you can say, these are the words of the Prophet. There's not really even a limit to forgeries, because you could have someone today forge a hadith. I remember during the first Gulf War, this one guy in, I think it was in Egypt, he said he had been digging around and he found these old manuscripts, and it said, the Prophet said that there's a man and his name will be derived from a tree and he will liberate the little hill fortress. Now, a tree, that's bush, right? And then Kuwait is like a little hill fortress. So, someone said this. So someone made this up. And of course, everybody knew it was made up. But my point is, there's no end or outer limit to these forgeries.
Yeah.
If you're going to say, okay, what is this book that you want to buy that's next to the Qur'an on the bookshelf in the bookstore? What is this going to be? Is this going to be Sunni hadiths? Is it going to be Shiite hadiths? Is it going to be hadiths that Sunnis believe are authentic? Or are the hadiths that Sunnis, they know they're not really true, but boy, they make a good point. Or, but they're a good story. So a lot of hadiths that you hear, let's say in a mosque, and I remember hearing lots of this in mosques in my day, is you'll hear hadiths that are not actually considered to be authentic even by Muslim scholars.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you'll hear the preacher use these hadiths. Why? Because maybe the Prophet said them, and boy, do they help make a point you're trying to make. So interest-bearing transactions are prohibited in Islamic law. Riba is the Arabic word for interest or usury.
Mm-hmm.
Remember it was in grad school in the khutbah, in the Friday prayer sermon, and the Imam says, the Prophet said there's 70 different kinds of riba, and the least serious is the equivalent of having sex with your mother. Right? So I was like, whoa.
Wow, that gets your attention really fast.
Yeah, I went in, I was thinking, boy, maybe I shouldn't have that savings account, like my 1% savings account or whatever. If you look at Muslim scholars, they'll say, no, this is not a reliable hadith.
Uh-huh.
But you find it in lots of hadith collections. Why? Because it's a great way to get people not to do riba.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of irony is that Islamic thought is, in a lot of ways, I call it a cult of authenticity. Islamic thought is obsessed with textual authenticity. The textual authenticity of the Qur'an is everything. The fact that you can go back to this scripture as it was originally revealed in its original language, uncorrupted, is essential. And the obsession over making sure you have the authentic precedent of the Prophet is also a major theme in Islamic thought. But at the same time, the same scholars, they realize sometimes there's these hadiths that maybe there's 20% chance the Prophet said it. So we're not lying. He said it, but according to the methods we've developed, he probably didn't say it, but it's such a great tool for teaching or for summing up something that it's used anyway. According to studies of, let's say, Muslim estate documents in 17th century Cairo, the second most commonly owned book by Muslims after the Quran was this book called Dala'il al-Khairat, Signs of the Good, which is a book of prayers said for the Prophet. Mm-hmm. And the first chapter is just all these hadiths about the reward that you get as a Muslim for sending your peace and blessings upon the Prophet, saying prayers for the Prophet.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And the vast majority of hadiths in that chapter, not only are they're unreliable, they're just utter fabrications. So you could make a good argument that if you wanted to say, what is the way that a typical Muslim at some point in Islamic history has interacted with the hadith tradition, you could say this book is a pretty good representation, it would be a pretty good candidate for that. And yet it's not at all representative of what Muslim scholars would have said is the authentic precedent of the Prophet.
So you've got this gigantic mass of reports, and as you said, it's unmanageably large, and it has to get pared down. It has to be cropped somehow. And at the popular level, people do it in their own way, but then the scholars do it a different way.
Yeah. In Sunni Islam, you have basically 6 books. There are 6 collections that are written in the 9th century that are compiled, and 2 of them are considered to be very authentic. The contents are considered to be the most reliably authenticated sayings of the Prophet. These are what's called the Sahihain, the two authentic or two sound hadith collections. One by a scholar named al-Bukhari, who died 870, and then one other one by his student, a guy named Muslim, who's also Muslim. Muslim is his name. He died 875 of the Common Era. These books are the most reliable in Sunni Islam. And then there's 4 other ones that are widely cited as well. But of course, the irony is that those 4 other ones have a lot of hadiths in them that Muslim scholars acknowledge are actually very unreliable. But they're in there sometimes because they're very good at making a point, sometimes because they deal with an issue which is not considered to be core to law and theology. For example, there's a hadith that would say, it's wonderful to be good to your mother. Okay, we already know it's good to be good to your mother from the Qur'an and reliable hadith, so this doesn't really add anything, but it might be an unreliable version. So that's the kind of material. And then in Shiite Islam, they have 4 main collections.
When thinking about religion returns, Dr. Brown and I discussed the all-encompassing nature of Islamic law. One thing I think that Westerners and non-Muslims a lot of times don't grasp about Islam is sort of how all-encompassing Islamic law is supposed to be. Tell us a little bit about the all-comprehensive nature of Islamic law and how this relates to the need for all of these oral reports.
As far as I know, there's nothing in the Quran or even the Sunnah of the Prophet where it explicitly says, you Muslims, you need to, whenever you're trying to figure out what's right or wrong or what you should do, you should think about what God wants. But it's just assumed and taken for granted from the very beginning of the Islamic tradition and never questioned essentially until the modern period, until kind of Muslims come into contact with Protestant West in the modern period. It's never questioned that every conceivable action, every conceivable thing you could say or do has some ruling in the eyes of God. So can I drink the coffee with my right hand or with my left hand? Can I wear these pants I'm wearing? Can I wear cloth socks? If I walk outside and I see a plant on the ground, can I eat that plant? Can I, every question you could possibly have, God has an answer for whether that thing is prohibited, required, disliked, recommended, or just neutral, right? And so what's called the ulama, Muslim scholars, from the very beginning of Islam, their job is to answer these questions. And they do so using the resources at their hands, which are first the Quran, then the Sunnah of the Prophet. And of course, there's different competing understandings of what the best way to know the precedent of the Prophet is. Is it through lived tradition? Is it through traditions of problem solving and reasoning? Is it through just kind of collecting and compiling hadiths and sort of trying to figure out which hadith actually bears on that one particular question? Another tool they might have is analogical reasoning. So, if the Quran says, that wine is prohibited, well, we assume it's because that wine makes you intoxicated and kind of irresponsible and reckless and things like that and lose your inhibitions. So then what happens about I come across this other drink or this, whiskey or beer or marijuana or heroin or whatever, so do these things apply? Are these things prohibited as well? Kind of by analogical reasoning. And then part of it is simply just, okay, what is in the best interests of the Muslims? What does, what overall does God want from us in the world? Like, would this ruling cause undue hardship for Muslims? So these are the kind of reasoning that Muslim scholars have engaged in for 1,400 years. I think part of this was simply trying to manage a world that was incredibly diverse. I mean, Muslims found themselves ruling over Buddhists in Central Asia and Jews in Egypt and, Christians in North Africa and Muslims throughout that entire world, right? And so they saw the variety of culture and experience, and they realized these people really don't have a lot in common. And so if you want to have a kind of a system of norms and a legal code that can actually bind this universe together, it has to be drawn from these sources that Muslims agreed upon, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. And so that's why they tried to kind of answer every question they could through those sources. I think that really only gets challenged in the kind of modern period when Muslims, especially at the late 19th century, start to be, under colonial domination by Britain and France and the Netherlands, and they kind of come face to face with this sort of Protestant understanding of Christianity, which says, no, religion is really only supposed to occupy this small part of life, a private part of life, and law and public space are supposed to be controlled by sort of these secular notions of value and morality. And so then Muslims start having to deal with that.
Well, I want to come back to the modern era because there's so much interesting discussion in your book about how to negotiate modernity and traditional Islamic tradition. But before we leave the classical traditions, so they're trying to build this whole systematic law, which kind of dictates a whole way of life. It's kind of creating a culture, an international culture in a sense. At the same time, they don't want to just use any oral report, right? Nobody wants to build something on a forgery. So how do the scholars pare down this mass of reports into what's usable?
There's two competing approaches that Muslim scholars use. One ultimately wins out. The second one, which I'll mention. The first one is to say, if you want to know what is reliably the words of the Prophet and what isn't, then you compare it to the Qur'an, you compare it to what you know about the Prophet's character, what you know, what's reasonable, what reason tells you, and if it sort of matches those things, then it's something the Prophet said, and if it contradicts those things, then it's not something the Prophet said. That was especially advanced by Muslim rationalists in the early Islamic period. Mm-hmm. Now, when I use the word rationalist, it's important to remember that I don't mean that they would have gone along the street and say, you can't park your car in that space, it's too small. They're not reasonable in the sense of, one person can't eat a 35-foot hoagie sandwich or something. When I mean reasonable, rationalists, they believe that human faculty of reason can access truth and give you information about the divine.
They put trust in speculative philosophy, basically.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Exactly. Separately from revelation. Mm-hmm. The other school approach said, wait a second, the Qur'an has warned us that communities go astray when they start following their own whims, their own sense of right and wrong, when they start speculating about the nature of God. And what Muslims are told to do is to stick to the Qur'an and the Sunnah of the Prophet, okay? And not to just indulge your whims and reasoning. That will lead you astray. The problem is, how do you authenticate what might be words of the Prophet versus what aren't words of the Prophet? If you're saying you don't trust your own reason.
Yeah. And we're past the lifetime of any eyewitnesses here. We're a couple hundred years
exactly.
on.
So what you try to do is you say, okay, let's try and reconstruct the transmission of these things. We'll find out who's a reliable transmitter, who isn't, who's corroborated and who isn't. And we'll look at these different chains of transmission. We'll try and figure out what is reliably transmitted. The idea there was you try and take reason out of the equation because human reason is not reliable. And so this was the approach advocated by early Sunni Islam. And what ended up happening is by the 1000s, these two approaches sort of merge in the Sunni and Shiite traditions. And you get an approach which says that, okay, if something clearly contradicts the Quran, if it clearly contradicts the established precedent of the Prophet, if it just totally contradicts reason, then it can't be something the Prophet said. But we're going to try and think of every possible way of reconciling this alleged hadith with the Quran and with the Sunnah and with reason. Like if we'll give it incredible charity and we'll really try and exhaust every possible explanation before we throw something out because of its meaning. That became the kind of orthodox Muslim approach. And that was not really controversial until, again, the kind of modern period when Muslims, through discovery of Western science, through kind of exposure to modern Protestant European notions of social sensibility and religion, some Muslims became skeptical and sort of disenchanted with many aspects of the hadith literature. And so they would use the meanings of they said, the meaning of these hadiths are absurd or reprehensible, and so we can't accept them. That's a big area or huge kind of fault line in Islamic thought today between what you might call reformist or liberal Muslims and traditionalist Muslims is how to what extent you indulge the rejection of hadiths based on their meaning in the modern period.
When thinking about religion returns, we discuss a few of the most notorious and controversial hadith reports. Dr. Brown, in your book, Quoting Muhammad, you have very interesting discussions about how various traditional or modernizing, more recent Islamic scholars have dealt with what look like strange or morally problematic passages in the Hadith or in the Qur'an. I was wondering if we could discuss one of each kind, one strange and one that's morally problematic. So one famous report says, and this is in the al-Bukhari collection, I believe, it says, if a fly lands in your drink, push it all the way under, then throw the fly out and drink. On one of the fly's wings is disease, on the other is its cure. How would the scholars deal with this report?
This is a kind of a great case study or kind of paradigmatic example of the debate over hadiths in the modern period. You know, when people start discussing this, let's say the late 1800s, early 1900s, you know, the rise of germ theory and stuff like that, some Muslim kind of reformist or liberal Muslim scholars would say, it's not these guys' fault. They didn't know this stuff is not true. They didn't know this was a dangerous idea. This clearly can't be something the Prophet said, because he would never advance an idea that's so dangerous, you know, in terms of health, public health. But I mean, now we know it can't be true, so get rid of it. Problem is that this hadith had been authenticated by the medieval scholars who were seen as the kind of acme of the Islamic scholarly method for authenticating hadiths. So if they messed up on that, then it really calls into question the entire edifice. There's a huge liability here, a potential consequence of rejecting this. So this hadith and others like it are really huge subjects for debate in the late 19th, early 20th century and until today. The funny thing is, which is interesting, is that this hadith was the center of the same debate in the 800s and the 700s and 800s. This same hadith of the fly was being debated over by Muslim rationalists and early Sunnis in the 700s. The Muslim rationalists would say, how can it be that an animal both has a disease and a cure on its body? It doesn't work. How can they both be present? Right? So we're having the exact same debate. And then the Sunnis said exactly what a traditional Sunni would say today, which is, your little brain does not have the capacity to question God's wisdom or the knowledge of the Prophet. If they say this, your job is to say, we hear and we obey. And if you don't do that, you will destroy the mechanisms by which we have received our religion. So the debate is exactly the same 1,300 years later. And in one sense, and this is, one could argue, hard to avoid, where you're simply left with that choice. You're left with a choice of saying, do I reject this because it doesn't seem to make sense to me based on pretty good reasoning? Or do I accept that God and the Prophet know better and that I should obey them?
I mean, on the face of it, an outsider might wonder, well, Muhammad is a real 7th century man. I mean, why can't he just believe in a popular superstition? Not everything he says has to be a prophecy from God, so why not just say that about it?
Yes, this is a good point. So that's what some Muslim scholars said in the 20th century. They said, look, this actually may have been something the Prophet said, but the Prophet isn't an astronomer. The Prophet's not a public health specialist, right? So he doesn't know that flies are unhealthy. He's just saying what, people say today, like, don't, I don't know, what's something people say today, like, don't eat after 6 p.m. or something if you want to lose weight. I don't know. But here's the problem, which is, wait a second, if the Prophet is infallible, there's a very famous report, it's considered to be authentic, where the Prophet he sees these farmers kind of planting young date palms, and he gives them advice and it doesn't work. And he says, you know better the affairs of your world than I do. But if I tell you something from God, then I don't make mistakes about that. But then the question is, if Islam is a religion that is totally comprehensive in our lives, then what exactly doesn't come from God, right? I mean, we're supposed to think about, what does God want from us in everything we do, whether it's how we dress or how we eat or how we sleep or how we talk, right? Then where exactly is this secular space, this worldly space that the Prophet is saying we know more than he does? It's hard to tell. And is this fly example one of those examples? Because the Prophet says in the Hadith, he says, if a fly lands in one of your drinks, then push it under and then take it out, because one wing is disease and the other wing is cure. Interestingly, he doesn't actually say drink it, which is interesting. That's just assumed to be the case. So
it's entirely possible that what you're saying is true. That maybe he was wrong about this. But then you start skating perilously close to having a debate about, well, what other things could he have been just talking about local custom regarding? What other things could he have been saying that were just based on superstition or beliefs that were prevalent at the time, but which we now know are false? Mm-hmm. It's kind of opens a Pandora's box of challenging all sorts of aspects of the religion. This hadith is like one of those, you'll hear people bring this up over, Muslims who've lost their faith in the hadith tradition or who stop identifying with traditional Islamic thought. A lot of times it's hadiths like this that provoke that, because they'll say, you're telling me I have to accept this, and I'm not going to eat something that a fly landed on. Mm-hmm. No, I'm not going to do that. So I don't believe this. So I guess I'm not a traditional Muslim in that case. It's really an issue where people have to choose kind of how they want to view the world and what they want to believe. Mm-hmm. My own opinion is that, I think it's really interesting, actually. So there's an early scholar, one of the founders of the four Muslim schools of law, a guy named Shafi'i. He died at 820 of the Common Era. He actually talks about if a fly lands on, like in a pile of urine or a puddle of urine, mm-hmm. and then lands on your clothing, he says that you don't have to change the clothing, because you would constantly have to change your clothes because you can't control like where flies land on you and stuff. Mm-hmm. What I thought was interesting is that he looks at the fly's feet, right? So when we talk about, public health problems of flies, we don't talk about their wings. We talk about their feet and their mouths, right? So why are flies dangerous? Because they go, especially in areas where there's like open defecation and stuff, mm-hmm. they go and they land on feces, and they come and land on your food, and they walk on it, and they, do their little Jeff Goldblum fly eating thing on it. Mm-hmm. And that is a totally different issue. The hadith doesn't address that. If the Islamic tradition from the very early period is saying that what flies land on, if it's ritually unclean, that can affect your ability to wear or eat something, that's a separate issue that's not even addressed by the hadith. So if a fly lands in my house, if a fly lands on something and then it lands in my drink, I'll push the fly in and take it out, and I'll drink it, and I'll follow the hadith of the Prophet. But if I'm in, India or someplace like that where there's a strong likelihood that they're flying and landing on things that are ritually unclean, or even outside, like in a public park or something here in the U.S., I would not do that. Not because I'm disregarding the Prophet's hadith, but because the Prophet's hadith doesn't address the issue of that fly having landed on something that was ritually unclean.
So that's an approach of trying to sort of find the underlying reason or the underlying concern and then apply that rather than just focus on what's explicitly said?
What you're saying is something different. That would be kind of what was the intention of a law. So if you said, for example, the Quranic verses on inheritance that say that a daughter should get one half the inheritance of a son, you could say, well, this was revealed at a time when men owned everything, and it's actually trying to create some degree of, to carve out some rights for women. But today, when women and men are both earning money and they're both professionally, have the ability to be professionally successful, then that same intention today would lead us to change this law. The law itself was only meant for certain circumstances. Those circumstances have changed. With the fly hadith, it's tough because it's not actually saying, it does say why, it says there's disease on one wing and a cure on the other, mm-hmm. but basically you're forced to say either the Prophet was wrong or he was right. Mm-hmm. And saying the Prophet was wrong is very dangerous. Mm-hmm. So what my approach is on this hadith is simply just to look at another angle of it, which is to say that none of this actually talks about the fact that the fly might have landed in something dirty, which Muslim scholars from the early period realized was a different discussion.
Well, one of the great strengths of your book, Misquoting Muhammad, is you seize the bull by the horns and discuss a number of things that have become controversial in the modern time, especially. So let's talk about one of those in the Qur'an. Surah 4, the 4th chapter of the Qur'an, advises husbands whose wives have somehow seriously disrespected them to, quote, admonish them, leave them alone in their beds, and strike them, end quote. And critics have argued that this just is authorizing domestic violence. So how have modernists tried to deal with interpreting and applying this passage?
Well, what's interesting about this verse is the Prophet actually says things like, the best of you wouldn't strike your wives.
That's in the Hadith somewhere.
Yeah, he says that in a reliable Hadith. And it's also said about him in another Hadith that he never struck his wives or his servants. He never struck anybody except when he was fighting in war. So you have this, on one hand, what seems to be a general command given by the Qur'an. The Prophet himself is actually saying that the best of you would not actually ever strike your wives, and that this is not something you should do. So there's this tension there, and then that actually is played out in this Islamic law over the centuries as this kind of law on how husbands and wives should handle disputes. How it's dealt with is that some Muslim scholars, would actually kind of follow on that prophetic model of discouraging anyone from striking their wives and say that you can't strike your wife. You sort of left with a question of like, hey, well, how do you reconcile that opinion with the fact that the Quran actually offers this as a possibility? What becomes the kind of mainstream position in Islamic law is that husbands can strike their wives, but they go back to another hadith of the Prophet where he says that you can't strike them in a way that is darb mubarrih, which is strike them in a way that would cause any harm or leave any mark. That becomes sort of the standard Muslim opinion in Islamic law, which is that first you admonish your wife, then you stop sleeping with her, then if she still continues to engage in this kind of egregiously disobedient behavior, then you can strike them, but in a way that doesn't leave a mark or cause any injury. As I said, what's interesting is that you do have this, like even from the time of the Prophet himself, you have this kind of anxiety, I don't want to say anxiety, but sort of a tension with that verse where the Prophet's saying, no, this should not be something that you do. And certainly not a good Muslim wouldn't do this. Now, of course, this is not really controversial until the late 19th century, early 20th century. It's not controversial because it's not controversial in Western law, right? So, I mean, you look at British judges who were applying Muslim law in India, in British India, even in the late 19th century, they'll say, well, this is just like British law, right? I mean, British law allows husbands to use reasonable discipline against their wives. It's really when you get into kind of the mid-20th century concern about domestic violence, rape law reform, that this starts to become a big, in fact, maybe the greatest problem that Muslims face. And not in the social problem, but I mean in the sense of interpretive problem, because with hadiths, you can always say, you know what, I just don't believe the Prophet said this. I don't care what the consequences are. I just don't believe he said this. This verse on wife beating is in the Quran, and you can't say it's not there. So there's one approach by Muslim scholars, some more reformist Muslim scholars have said, the verse never meant beat. The verse adribhunna means leave them, basically just abandon them, leave them, like leave your wife. And they say that word can mean that in certain circumstances. The problem with that is, if you choose that interpretation, then it means that all the hadiths and all the Quranic commentary and all the law based on that is wrong.
Yeah, 1,000 years of people have been misreading that somehow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you get out of this problem, but the cost you pay is essentially the stability of the entire tradition that you're trying to preserve to begin with.
There's so much interesting material in your book about how the legal traditions, both pre-modern and modern, deal with some of these issues. And it seems to me there's kind of I don't know what you could call it, a moderating trend in all of it. So, for instance, you discuss the tradition of cutting off a thief's hand. And basically, they raise the evidentiary standards so high that it's almost never applied. And that's one way of sort of making the entire law, I don't know, kinder and gentler. Could that be what's going on with these hadith reports that you mentioned? So that Muhammad never struck anybody, or that he only said that you could strike lightly. Could that be people, they see this in the Quran and well, let's not take this too far, people. And so they're already trying to moderate it at that early stage?
You raise a good question. But I think there's an important distinction to make, right? So the Quranic rules on punishments, things like stoning, hand cutting, right? The Islamic legal tradition on that is from the very beginning, from within the Quranic text itself, has this intentional moderation. How do we know it's intentional? Because this goes back to the verse about punishment for sort of illicit sex.
Mm-hmm.
The Qur'an says, if one of your women engages in sexual indiscretion, then punish them with 100 lashes. This is then expanded also to men, etc., but this is the specific verse. But another verse says, if you accuse someone of this, you have to have 3 other witnesses. And if you don't have 3 other witnesses, you will be punished by 80 lashes for slander.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Prophet adds to that in his hadiths that if it's sex, you actually have to have seen, as the hadith says, you have to have seen the eyeliner pencil go into the eyeliner case. Do you understand? Right?
Uh-huh.
You actually have to have seen penetration.
Right.
So 4 people have to have seen penetration to occur.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have that and you make the accusation, you get lashed 80 times.
Mm-hmm.
So within the Quranic text itself, you can't say this is, if the Quran said stone people who commit adultery, and then Muslim scholars come along and they say, oh boy, this is really serious. We better figure out some way to moderate this. Oh yeah, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is internal to the Quranic text. It's giving you extremely harsh punishment, and then itself providing,
Mm-hmm.
it's saying that it's very hard to prove this.
Mm-hmm.
The reason for that is, I feel this is pretty clear, that it's very common in pre-modern law codes to have very serious punishments, but then have mechanisms built into the law to make it very hard to apply those punishments. Why? Because pre-modern states didn't really have mechanisms for preventative policing or investigative policing. Basically, to deter people away from doing crimes, you had to scare the bejesus out of them, and this was a good way. But you don't actually want to have to stone people and cut their hands off. You want them to be scared and to realize the severity of these crimes. The difference between that and the Quranic verse on beating is that the Quran does not include something that says, but only beat your wife if, she's taken 2 frying pans and bashed you on your head between them or something like that. It doesn't create any situation where it really leaves this up to the spouse.
It's unclear when it kicks in.
The Prophet then creates caution around that, but it's not internal to the Quran. If you're a Muslim scholar or someone discussing this from a Muslim perspective, you're immediately left with a possibility that hadith is made up, and then you're left with this problem, which is, wait a second, you've opened a door, even a little bit of door to spousal abuse, and of course, men are going to run right through this. How can you open the door and then only have the Prophet's sort of hortatory cautioning about this and not have him say, do not do this, right? So you open the door, you don't close it all the way. And of course, abuse happens. So that's the kind of maybe the main anxiety and objection around this from a lot of Muslim scholars today, or Muslim intellectuals and Muslims today.
When thinking about religion returns, attempts to reform Islamic tradition and what the future of Sunni Islam might look like. Dr. Brown, I was really curious after reading this book. There were a lot of accounts of attempts to reform in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, and it seemed to me that in some cases the reformers didn't necessarily get very far, and also there's been this massive shift from, in the pre-modern era, there were these dominant schools of interpretation, and scholars really played this mediating role in how the Qur'an and just Islamic tradition is understood by the masses. And it seemed to me that that's not exactly coming back, and also the regional barriers have been broken down. Where does Islamic tradition go from here? Is there going to be a new school of interpretation at some point that's international? Is there going to be a reformist branch? How do you see this developing? I'm sorry, that's a huge question.
No, it's a $64,000 question in a lot of ways. Basically, in one sense, I'd say that one has to remember that if Muslims were hanging out in a room having this discussion privately, that would be one thing. But this whole discourse, when European and American Christians have discussions about abolition of slavery or reform or whatever, they have this from a position of confidence and superiority. They're not being pushed and directed and pulled in any way. Muslims have this discussion under colonial rule and then under essentially what you might consider kind of the imperialism of global Western consumer capitalist culture, right? So if you say, like that hadith of the fly, it's not just about, hey, wait a second, let's talk about where exactly the lines are of where the prophet's revealed knowledge is versus his own kind of speculation or his own restatement of existing superstitions, or let's talk about whether or not the system of Muslim authentication has worked in this case. It immediately becomes, are you adopting the modern Western worldview, or are you going to have the traditional authentic Islamic worldview? And that's a political position. Are you going to wear a tie, a suit and tie? Are you going to wear a robe and a turban?
It's a kind of a culture war position.
Yeah, that's actually a great analogy, right? You can imagine Americans today having a debate. There's any number of things we could do, Kavanaugh hearings, like anything, right? Anything we could talk about that is not really about that thing. It's really about which of these two giant poles that are just sucking everything towards them. Which one are you going to go towards? It's impossible to have an independent discussion, a kind of authentic, real discussion. So that's one reason that when you talk about the success or failure of Muslim reformists, is that debates about reform or debates about proper understanding of Islam in the modern world, a world that is very technologically, economically, socially different than the world 200 years ago. Muslims aren't allowed to, and they aren't able to have these debates in a kind of, I hate to use this word, almost like a safe space. They can't have this in a space that's insulated from these political pressures that just pull everything apart. And let's be honest, right? A lot of Western discussions of, why don't Muslims reform? Why can't Muslims be like us? Are really about political domination. When people talk about the problems of the Islamic Republic of Iran, they might be talking about the treatment of women, but what they're really talking about is why don't they accept American political domination? You can't separate these. It's not like Muslims are imagining this dynamic. The dynamic is there, and sometimes even intentionally there from the point of view of, let's say, American or just generally Western culture or American politics. So that's one thing. The second thing you mentioned about is, you talked about is like the role of the ulama as mediators. Here you can almost go to sort of Protestant Reformation and the use of print and things like that, Muslims don't really adopt print until the 19th century. And one of the reasons is because Muslim scholars understand that writing is dangerous. They want to control access to writing and they want to control access to reading. Because if you let people write and read on their own, God knows what they're going to come up with. So I'm always sort of amused by this idea, when you read some mags, like The Economist will have some article about how Muslims are trying to challenge tradition and, come to their own ideas about what their religion means. That's a dice roll. And this is precisely what, Catholic critics of the Reformation said. Yeah, you might get some guy who comes up with a moderate, wonderful understanding of Christianity, but you might get the Anabaptist Kingdom of Munster or something where people are complete lunatics and of going around executing people if they don't support polygamy, right? So today, ISIS or some lone wolf terrorist, you say, oh, how could he have come to this understanding? Well, he just did what you said he should do. He went on his own and he decided he wanted to understand the religion. When you break down interpretive kind of structures of interpretive control, you get reformation, but you also get things that are out of control.
Does the internet and just the ability to read the Qur'an, are we heading in the direction where in 100 years, your average Muslim will have a study Qur'an, which will just have some short notes?
There is a study Qur'an now.
And they just use that to bypass. That's going to have traditional guidance, obviously, in it.
Yeah.
But is that going to be the extent of traditional input then in the future? Or is there enough structure to kind of...
So I would say this. I would say, as with print and the internet, people have the capacity to access information, and they have a selection of choices, interpretive choices, that they don't have if they're simply going to their local village imam who's the one person who's going to tell them how to understand their religion.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, you also have the possibility for voices and institutions to try and increase their presence in that marketplace of ideas and to attract readers or viewers, to influence people, to sort of potentially dominate that space.
Mm-hmm.
So choice and technologies that allow people to access material directly are destabilizing, but they also are media and fora that structures of interpretive control can use to expand their own control.
Mm-hmm.
So in places like Saudi Arabia and Egypt or the UAE, these countries are extremely active in dominating how people understand religion inside their national borders. Despite the fact you have the internet and books and all this stuff, they simply control what books are there. They control what websites people go to. They fund people to have more presence in the internet or on TV than other people might. And so, states especially have the power to dominate these media. Tradition here, I mean the desire for holders of power and influence to assert interpretive control. They can do so in this newly varied and changing marketplace, just as people did with print in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think your last question was about, is there kind of an international, you had before in Sunni Islam, you had kind of 4 schools of law.
Yeah.
And now is there kind of some modern version? I think in one sense, if you're a Muslim living in Pakistan, there's really only one school of law. There's a Hanafi school of law. And, Muslim scholars in Pakistan will discuss issues like organ donation and Bitcoin and all that stuff. And they'll come up with their opinions, but they'll do so from the Hanafi framework. And Muslims there will pretty much live within that world because that's the world that they live in. Same thing in North Africa, where it's mostly Maliki school of law.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that where you see the real kind of formation of an international approach is with Muslim minorities in the West, because they come from lots of different national origins. And they're also in situations that in the Muslim world, Muslim majority world, you don't have to worry about having a place to pray. I mean, there's always a place to pray.
Right.
Whereas, in the U.S., might not be a place to pray. You might not be able to find a restaurant that doesn't serve alcohol if you're very strict about that, or a place that serves halal meat.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a Bosnian Muslim and a Muslim from West Africa and an Arab Muslim and a Pakistani Muslim. And so they're all kind of, you don't have one unified tradition to draw on. So in those areas, what you've seen, especially Muslims in the West, is like them kind of creating their own, what some people called jurisprudence of minorities, their own kind of minority understandings of Islam that sort of take a bit from this and a bit from that to come up with kind of amalgamated hybrid understanding of Islam and Islamic law.
Mm-hmm. So that's one more competitor. It may be in a local marketplace more than internationally.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But to be honest, I think if you looked internationally today, the major debate amongst Muslims isn't over necessarily how you understand Islamic law.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the role of the state and where that state falls in the struggle over the future direction of mankind. I mean, I know that sounds grandiose, but think about this, right? So Saudi Arabia is a very conservative country,
Mm-hmm.
but they are very happy to ally with Israel. They are very happy to, in places like Morocco, which is sort of in the same camp that they do things like, or in Tunisia, they're now trying to make it illegal for someone to follow the Quranic rules of inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
So what you see is even some of the more traditionally conservative countries, their governments are actually proposing a liberalization or moderation of religious law,
Mm-hmm.
but provided that it is done with the permission and under the control of the state. And they do so in an effort to say, we are modern, Western-friendly states. And so it comes along with things like going along with Western European or sort of NATO and American political priorities.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas other Muslims say, no, this is unacceptable. It's not unacceptable because you're liberalizing, you're becoming moderate. A lot of those Muslims might actually support moderating reforms of Islamic law, but they see these as not sincere, but rather they're simply attempts to placate the West as part of political process, a part of building a political alliance with forces that a lot of Muslims globally see as unjust, not just sort of dominating, but as dominating in an unjust way. So you could think about kind of global North versus global South, or kind of global imperial versus global subalterns. In a way, Islamic law is simply being contested between kind of global capitalist versus global subaltern, global neoliberal versus global oppressed. Sometimes I look back and 5 years ago, and sometimes I pinch myself, like, what the heck is happening? It's just, I mean, where was it? There was a couple of years ago, Tony Blair was giving a speech. It was, I think, 2014, saying we need to embrace the liberal and moderate Islam of Saudi Arabia and reject the Islamic extremism of the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, that's insane. I mean, that is insane.
Say a little more about why, in your view, that's insane. I think that'll strike a lot of Brits and Americans as sensible.
Because has anyone checked what Saudi Arabia, has anyone ever thought about, Saudi Arabia is a country that actually implements Sharia law directly. Like they have a Sharia judiciary.
Yeah. But they're moderate because they cooperate with us.
They moderate because they're politically moderate. Whereas the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt, these guys are wearing ties. They're saying part of the Sharia is that we don't implement the Sharia. You know, we have a state run by institutions, so even a Christian can be president. It's not I mean, if you look at, Muslim Brotherhood or different Islamist groups have been at the forefront of arguing for reforms in Islamic law in the 20th century. But they're not, quote unquote, moderate because their idea is that Muslims will use their religion to create political independence. So you have a situation where Islamic extremism versus Islamic moderation are not about what we would think about in terms of liberal and conservative views of religion, kind of Orthodox Jew versus Reformed Jew, or evangelical Christian versus lapsed mainstream Protestant Christian. But it's become transposed into whether or not you support the kind of, and I don't even want to say American dominated, because now countries like China are just as interested in this, is a sort of state dominated and state controlled world of religion versus a world of religion where the traditionally oppressed or powerless or subalterns use and enjoy religion as a space to create independent existence. A lot of people who were Islamists in the 20th century started out as Marxists or kind of anti-colonialists or even nationalists because Islamism simply became another the best mechanism for pushing back against colonialism or post-colonial cultural imperialism or political imperialism, right? So these two things become inextricably mixed.
Yeah. In a way, there's no sort of isolating out just a purely religious component, which has no implications for government.
Yes.
Dr. Brown, thanks so much for talking with us.
It has been a pleasure. I hope I did a good job.
Muhammad either was or was not the last and greatest prophet sent by the one true God. In our culture, many would assume that one couldn't possibly know or have a reasonable belief either way. But I don't see why not. And so it seems to me this allegedly historical material is relevant to those among us who are trying to make up our minds. We can look in the Qur'an. We can read the earliest surviving biography of him called the Sirat Rasul Allah by Ibn Ishaq. And we can wade into the vast ocean of the Hadith reports. When we do, we'll immediately be looking for the help of scholars like Dr. Brown. This week's Thinking Music has been the track Between Worlds, instrumental, by Tobias Weber. I'm Dale Tuggy, and this has been Thinking About Religion. Thanks for listening.